What happens if the pilots of an airliner suddenly realise that their plane doesn't respond to any control inputs, that their yokes or side sticks or even their rudder pedals are basically useless? How could anyone fly, let alone land, that aircraft? Failures like these are thankfully incredibly rare, but it's not unheard of. Some of you may remember some examples, but did you know that NASA scientists and test pilots have not only tried, but succeeded in figuring out how to give back control to the pilots in such events and help them land their aircraft safely when none of their flight controls work? Well, that's what I'm going to explain in this video. But I'm also going to show that perhaps more could be done to make aircraft safer today using the lessons of NASA's valuable research. So, some of the viewers over on the Mentour Pilot channel may remember a video that Petter made quite a few years ago now about the Sioux City crash of United Airlines Flight 232. If you don't remember it, well, it's an old video. And if you want to see how much our production value has gone up over the years, then it's definitely worth a watch. But anyway, in this accident, a Douglas DC-10 on its way from Denver to Chicago was flying at its cruising altitude when engine number 2, located on the tail, suffered a catastrophic and uncontained failure. Now, losing one engine out of 3 is a bad day in the office, but it's not catastrophic in itself. The problem here was that the engine's disc broke apart, sending high-speed debris in all directions, rupturing multiple hydraulic lines in the process. Like all modern aircraft though, the DC-10 was designed with multiple redundant systems for safety critical systems, meaning that multiple systems could do the same job, making sure that at least one of those systems would always be available, even if the others failed. That's why the DC-10 had 3 independent hydraulic systems, and the route that the different hydraulic lines follow through the aircraft are also different. So if something affects one system, the others will be working normally. But in a cramped area like the tail section, hydraulic lines for the different systems inevitably get much closer together. Now, there's much more to this that I'm skipping here, including hydraulic valves and fuses that stop a leak from draining all fluid in such an event. But in the case of United 232, that uncontained failure ruptured all 3 of the DC-10's hydraulic systems, and soon afterwards the total hydraulic pressure dropped to 0. Which, among other things, meant that the pilots could no longer move any of the aircraft's control surfaces. A nightmare scenario like this is often called a black swan event, something that is thankfully extremely rare, but disastrous when it does. However, despite this unique problem, United 232 didn't simply stop flying. All commercial aircraft are designed to be aerodynamically stable, and as long as they remain intact, the aircraft want to fly. Again, Petter goes into much more detail about what happened in the Mentor Pilot video, but the point here is that the 2 pilots and the flight engineer, along with a 3rd pilot that joined them soon afterwards, quickly worked out a plan. If they couldn't move any of the control surfaces on the tail or the wings, they could try manoeuvring the aircraft using just a thrust from the engines instead. So how does that work? Well, whilst the engines are fitted to propel the aircraft through the air, they also provide some secondary effects which are dependent on where they're fitted on the aircraft. Like every object on Earth, the aircraft has a centre of gravity, around which the aircraft rotates and moves. When the aircraft is flying with all of its forces balanced, for example with symmetrical thrust set, which equals the drag, the lift equals the weight, and the aircraft is in trim, the aircraft will be flying in a state of equilibrium. Therefore, in this example, it will be flying straight and level in unaccelerated flight. But as soon as one of those forces changes, that equilibrium is disrupted, and the change in force will result in the aircraft moving about its centre of gravity. So let's look at an example. Let's say we're flying in straight and level, balanced flight, and we increase thrust on the left engine only. The thrust is no longer symmetrical, and the higher thrust being produced by the engine on the left wing will yaw the aircraft to the right around its centre of gravity. Now, as the aircraft yaws right, the wing on the left is now travelling slightly faster than the wing on the right, which results in an increase in lift on that left wing. And this symmetrical lift results in the aircraft rolling to the right. So the secondary effect of setting asymmetrical thrust is yaw and then roll. And similarly, if we go back to our straight and level aircraft in balanced flight again, and we now add thrust symmetrically, With no other inputs being applied, the aircraft will begin to accelerate as our thrust now exceeds the drag. But because the engines are located under the wings and below the centre of gravity, the increase in thrust rotates the aircraft nose up, and vice versa if thrust is reduced. So the secondary effect of changing thrust is pitch. Well, that's the theory, which obviously I'm simplifying here because there's more to consider. For example, the engines don't respond immediately to thrust lever commands. They take time to spool up and down, so the pilots need to compensate for that. And obviously the plane's inertia plays a role here too. And another element to consider here is that when the aircraft pitch attitude changes, for example if the nose pitches down as we reduce thrust, the subsequent descent will likely increase the aircraft's speed. This now results in an increase in lift, which in turn will cause the nose to pitch up again. And so we can get into an up and down phugoid motion that the plane's inertia and slow throttle response make hard to predict and even harder to control. All of this means that even when pilots recognize the problem quickly and start using the engines to keep the plane in control, as was the case with United 232, timing those engine inputs correctly can be incredibly hard to do. And as hard as this is in the cruise, it becomes so much harder when the pilots want to set up for an approach. The United crew diverted to Sioux City in Iowa, where they attempted what has to be one of the most challenging landings in history. Sadly, the high speed of the aircraft, a crosswind and a sudden roll right that developed close to the ground meant that the aircraft hit the runway with its right wing, with its pilots unable to respond in time. The aircraft broke apart at high speed, and in total 112 people perished, although 35 of those survived the initial impact but unfortunately died of smoke inhalation later. Thankfully though, 184 people did survive, which really is incredible given what the flight crew had to work with. So, what does NASA have to do with any of this? Well, we may think of space rockets when we think of NASA, but their name is actually an acronym, and the first A stands for aeronautics. And their people had some excellent ideas about how to handle such no-control black swan events. Now, since I'm constantly researching aviation incidents and airline policies, I'm always signing up for industry newsletters, downloading reports, and accessing databases worldwide. What I didn't expect though was how that would lead my inbox to overflowing with spam emails and texts on random topics such as car warranties and crypto investments from companies I've never even heard of. But thankfully, once I started using today's sponsor, Delete Me, all of that stopped. Now, I used to think all of this was just random spam, but there's a reason this stuff finds us so easily. There's companies called data brokers that literally buy and sell your personal information, whether that's phone numbers, email addresses, shopping habits, even your home address, to anyone willing to pay. And perhaps more worryingly, when someone buys your information, they can automatically see your relatives' details too. Now, Delete Me will track down where your personal information is being sold, and it makes those companies delete it. And in just 7 days, they showed me a report with 73 data broker sites and over 200 pieces of personal information that they've removed. Honestly, it was shocking, but it doesn't stop there. Delete Me also keep monitoring these sites, so when brokers try to relist your information, it gets removed again. And the best part for me is that knowing by signing up, I'm also keeping my family safe. Now, if this sounds like something that would make your life easier, you can get 20% off Delete Me's US consumer plans at joindeleteme.com/mentor now, or by scanning this QR code, but just remember to use the code mentor now. Thank you, Delete Me, for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to the story. Now, the United 232 accident in 1989 wasn't the first or the last time that pilots had faced such a control failure. Japan Airlines Flight 123 had only happened about 4 years earlier and also involved a total lack of hydraulics. Tragically, that 747 crashed into mountainous terrain after its crew struggled to control it for over half an hour. And 2 decades before that, an Eastern Airlines Lockheed Super Constellation had a mid-air collision with a TWA Boeing 707 over Carmel in New York State. The 707's crew managed to make a successful emergency landing, but the crew in the Super Connie found that they had no flight controls or elevator trim after the collision. The crew managed to regain control using only their engines and crash landed into an open field, Now, there were 4 fatalities out of 54 occupants, and again 2 of those fatalities were due to smoke inhalation. Then, in 1975, a US Air Force C-5 Galaxy was transporting evacuated orphans from Saigon in Vietnam and lost all hydraulics in the tail. The pilots still had aileron control, but had to rely on thrust modulation to control the aircraft pitch attitude. And unfortunately, they couldn't stop a phugoid motion on approach, which caused them to crash just short of the runway, and 176 survived out of the 314 occupants. Now, whenever a high-profile accident happens, pilots and many others in the industry sit up and take note, and study what they would need to do to deal with such an incident. One of the pilots in United 232 had previously thought about this in the aftermath of the Japan Airlines Flight 123. And in the aftermath of United 232, it was the turn of NASA engineer Bill Burcham to wonder, what could we do that might help pilots in a situation like this? Burcham started laying out his thoughts while on a TWA flight by drawing on a napkin. He was a propulsion engineer, and this was the era when more and more aircraft used computers not only for autopilot and flight controls, but also to have better control of the engines. Burcham's first thought, as he sketched it out on that napkin, was to link the aircraft's flight controls with computers that would also be fed with data about the aircraft's speed, attitude, weight, and other metrics, and then the computer would command the appropriate amount of thrust from each engine to make this happen. That's not quite how this system would eventually end up working though, as we'll soon see. But as author Tom Tucker explains in a NASA publication that outlines the program, that initial concept won over enough support within NASA to start growing, and it eventually became known as the Propulsion Controlled Aircraft Project. And the key assumption here was that a computer would be far quicker than a human at figuring out the right amount of thrust inputs to keep the aircraft under control. The computers would take into account any delays in engine response time, and they would factor in the plane's inertia and would be able to deal with both, as well as help prevent that phugoid up and down oscillation and the lateral yawing Dutch roll that could also develop in these events. Now, we are talking about the late 1980s and early 90s here, where computers aren't what they are right now. Quite a lot of people at NASA, including engineers and pilots, initially thought that this would actually be impossible. But after some initial work in a rudimentary simulator, the PCA project started gathering pace and became a full-scale project. However, even at this stage, way before the PCA project flew on an actual aircraft, it was really difficult, even for experienced test pilots, to control the system in a sim. And even with computers handling the throttle controls, the delay between control input and aircraft response could be as much as 20 seconds, and this led to over-controlling the aircraft in the simulator, which makes the actions of the United 232 crew even more amazing. They dealt with this same 20-second long feedback delay and still got the aircraft on the ground manually. Anyway, during those initial sim tests, the control input method for the PCA system was basically a joystick. But seeing how pilots were over-controlling the aircraft, one of NASA's test pilots, Gordon Fullerton, suggested replacing the joystick with a pair of thumb wheels, one for roll and the other for pitch. These thumb wheels were similar in principle to autopilot controls, because they weren't self-centering like yokes or control sticks. They would simply hold a commanded pitch or roll until the pilot would recenter them manually or make another input. The consensus here was that these controls were more useful. But while all of this worked well in a basic sim, everybody wanted to test this system on an actual aircraft. And the first aircraft that became available wasn't exactly what Burcham, Fullerton and the rest of the PCA team had in mind. At some point, the US Air Force had joined the project, and along with some much needed funding, they agreed to make an aircraft available for the team, an F-15 fighter. Now, as cool as a fighter may be, it had some issues. Using differential thrust for control works best if the two engines are a good distance apart from each other, which is the case for airliners with one engine under each wing. But the F-15's engines are only about 12 inches or 30 centimeters apart. Also, they are pretty close to the centre of the fuselage vertically instead of being underslung like most wing-mounted jet engines. But the F-15 had some qualities that could make up for all of this. Even though the engines were so close, they were super powerful. And a test in an F-15 sim proved that it was still possible to use a differential thrust to test the PCA hardware on it. But we'll come back to that in a minute. It's also worth bearing in mind here that this particular NASA F-15 wasn't your standard F-15. It was a modified test aircraft that had already been used to test something called the Highly Integrated Digital Electronic Control System, or HIDEC. This involved installation of a digital flight control system, basically a fly-by-wire, that the F-15s of that era just didn't have. Among other functions, these systems allowed the aircraft to identify a flight control surface that no longer worked and then reconfigure the remaining flight controls to compensate for it. So, adding a system that would allow the plane to use its engines for manoeuvring seemed like a reasonable next step. And NASA's HIDEC F-15 also had tested a digital electronic engine control, or DEEC, that was already configured to talk with the digital flight control system. So basically, all of the sensors and computing power that the propulsion control aircraft system would need were already installed on this particular aircraft. But the first actual PCA flights, made in the summer of 1991, revealed an issue that went back to the F-15's massive engines. Even though they were powerful enough to generate enough differential thrust to yaw the aircraft, despite their placement, in practice, slight variations in engine performance and response time made super fine control extremely difficult, if not impossible. Well, at least at first. And this isn't really surprising. In a typical airliner like I fly, we also have to keep such differences between the engines in mind. For example, when we push the throttles forward for takeoff, we first get the thrust up to an intermediate thrust level, wait a second or two for the thrust to stabilise symmetrically before selecting takeoff thrust. It took a bit longer for the PCA engineers to figure out what software was needed for the computers to compensate for the F-15's engine performance differences. They also accounted for ground effect, for the drag of the landing gear, and they even discovered that the giant movable inlets of the F-15's engines had minor pitch effects that also had to be taken into account. All of this took a long time and many more test flights. But in April of 1993, Gordon Fullerton made a bit of history by landing his F-15 successfully on nothing but differential engine controls. It was apparently a firm but acceptable landing, just 6 feet to the left of the runway centerline, but they had done it. More test flights by other pilots confirmed that the PCA system worked perfectly. But it was now time to install it on the kind of aircraft that inspired NASA's engineers and pilots to develop this technology in the first place. Now, this required a pretty hefty increase in budget. But by now, the project had support from even more players, including Boeing, who maybe seemed a bit reluctant at first, and McDonnell Douglas, who were much more enthusiastic thanks to their F-15 involvement. And since some versions of the McDonnell Douglas MD-11 were still in development at that time, the MD-11 became the natural choice for the next series of tests. But that's easier said than done. NASA obviously didn't have access to an MD-11, and weirdly, neither did Douglas. They actually had to borrow one that would later go to Delta Airlines. The test team applied all of the lessons learned from the F-15 trials, but they also added some important refinements. First of all, the two thumb wheel controls that they used on the F-15 were replaced by something much, much better: the MD-11's normal autopilot controls. And it was found in the sim that the MD-11 behaved just as it would do with normal autopilot operation, only slightly less accurately. It worked so well, in fact, that some invited test pilots would often ask, "Are you sure the hydraulics are actually off?" Then, in August 1995, it was time to verify that the technology worked on the real MD-11. The test crew flew the aircraft from their base in Yuma, Arizona to Edwards Air Force Base in California, which has some super long and super wide runways. After multiple approaches down first to 100 feet, then to 50, and then just 10, Fullerton made another approach, touching down safely while cameras showed that no control surfaces moved at all. But it actually gets better. These approaches were made with the test pilots constantly fine-tuning the heading and descent rates in the autopilot. But from very early on, a NASA engineer called John Conley thought, well, if we're going to use the plane's autopilot, why not try coupling the PCA software with an ILS? Now, an ILS, or Instrument Landing System, uses radio infrastructure at airports to guide aircraft down to the runway. So, about 3 months after the first PCA landings in the MD-11, NASA pilots repeated their landings at Edwards Air Force Base, which were now conducted almost like routine ILS autolands, making the system even easier to integrate into an airline's training. But it still wasn't over. These tests were conducted with the aircraft's hydraulics still operating, but with the control surfaces locked to their neutral positions. Even more testing proved that the PCA software worked with first 1, then 2, and finally all 3 hydraulic systems actually turned off, which meant that their flight control surfaces were free to float up or down in the airstream. This flight control floating changed the aircraft's handling ever so slightly, but after a bit of tweaking to the software, the results were exactly the same. Perfectly safe landings. The PCA system came through in exactly the kind of scenario that the 232 crew had faced those years before. But I'm sure a lot of you are actually thinking what I initially thought. All of this is great, so why aren't airliners equipped with this technology today? Because at least 2 more of these accidents happened after NASA's PCA success. The first of these was an Airbus A300 freighter operating for DHL that was hit by a surface-to-air missile shortly after takeoff from Baghdad in 2003. That aircraft lost all hydraulics after the missile hit its left wing, which soon started burning when the fuel in it ignited. The shrapnel also destroyed all 3 hydraulic systems, once again disabling all flight controls. Incredibly though, this particular flight crew managed to bring their aircraft back down for a safe landing in Baghdad by modulating the throttles manually. They did veer off the runway, but minimal damage was incurred as a result of the landing, and the crew walked away unscathed. Now that really is an incredible feat, but it was close. The crew had to spend time learning how to fly the plane in this condition, managing the same phugoid motion as previous crews, but they had to learn this fast because their left wing was now on fire. Then, more recently, we had the tragedy of the Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243, which was fired at by at least 2 missiles as it was trying to land in bad weather in Grozny in Russia. As we explained in previous videos, the crew flew across the Caspian Sea to Aktau in Kazakhstan, where they crash landed. Out of 67 occupants, 38 people, including the 2 pilots and 1 cabin crew, sadly lost their lives. So what's missing in this story? Okay, the Airbus A300 that was shot over Baghdad was made in 1979 before NASA's PCA worked, so it is understandable it didn't have the system. But why didn't the pilots in the Embraer over Russia last December have that system to fall back on? Well, there's several reasons, but the quick and frustrating answer here is complications with certification. NASA's work was obviously experimental. Its purpose was to work out the parameters that aircraft manufacturers would need to consider to make a propulsion-controlled aircraft a reality. But it was then up to the airlines to convince the FAA, EASA, and other authorities around the world to certify such a system. In technical terms, the software and hardware needed to make the PCA system work wasn't prohibitively expensive, but more avionics equipment was needed, and this requires expensive and time-consuming certification. NASA's PCA team later designed versions that would be easier to certify by using existing infrastructure in the airliners, like standard auto-throttle servos. These versions were called PCA Lite and PCA Ultralight, and NASA's engineers hoped that they would be fitted to new aircraft and retrofitted to existing ones. But unfortunately, despite more NASA work on the same concepts in the 1990s, including on 747 and 757 simulators, ultimately, as far as we can tell anyway, no aircraft was ever actually certified with a PCA system installed. I mean, to be fair, it did make more sense at the time to make hydraulic systems more resilient and less likely to suffer total losses, which is what manufacturers concentrated on. Also, not all aircraft use the same kinds of control systems. Some, including the Boeing 737 and the Embraer E190 that was shot at in Russia, also have wires linking the pilot controls to the control surfaces. Other designs, like the Boeing 787, don't use hydraulics at all, relying on electrical actuators instead. Now, with that being said, we have seen some of this NASA technology being applied in airliners today. For example, the 737 MAX has fly-by-wire spoilers on its wings, which enables a clever system called the Elevator Jam Landing Assist. This system can be activated by the crew in the event of a jammed elevator, which takes inputs from the control column and then uses those inputs to symmetrically raise or lower the spoilers to increase or decrease the rate of descent. But is this enough? When the NTSB issued its final report on the Sioux City crash of United Flights 232, one of its recommendations was as follows: encourage research and development of backup flight control systems for newly certified wide-body aeroplanes that utilize an alternative source of motive power separate from that source used for the conventional control system. And that's exactly what NASA's PCA project did. And with the fly-by-wire controls and electronic engine controls of modern airliners, I think it's hard to justify why we don't see such technology in our cockpits today. But I'd love to know what you think. Do you agree with this? Or have we missed something? And do you know of any aircraft that can fly on differential throttle inputs alone? Let us know in the comments below. I'm Ben Watts, you're watching Mentor now. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time.